I was a Christian child. Now, I know that people like Richard Dawkins would prefer that I say something like, I was born to Christian parents, but I really don't feel like that phrase does justice to my experience growing up. Let me break it down for you. I attended church for the first time when I was only a few days old. My parents dedicated me to God when I was a few months. At the age of 3, I accepted Jesus Christ into my heart as my personal Lord and Savior, was baptized in water at the age of 7, and was speaking in tongues by the time I was 12. Oh, did I mention that we were Pentecostal? That's the rolling around in the aisles speaking in tongues kind. Although, to be perfectly honest, I don't remember a lot of rolling around in the aisles. Falling down in the aisles, yes, and speaking in tongues, well, yeah, obviously that's kind of the point. I mean, you don't do that, you might as well be Baptist. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I mean, they're probably going to get into heaven. They just might not have as nice crowns or something. Anyway. Oh, and my dad was the pastor. I could spend hours telling you stories about my childhood, trying to convey some sort of sense of what it was like growing up in the environment I grew up in. But I feel like that's a little bit like trying to describe an orgasm to someone. Either you've had one, in which case there's no sense trying to explain it to you, or you haven't had one, in which case there's no sense trying to explain it to you. I think the closest you might get, if this wasn't also your experience, is to sit down and watch the documentary Jesus Camp and pretend, or try to pretend, that the whole thing isn't completely fucked up. Because that documentary, that could have been my life, aside from the fact that it was filmed in a different country, at a different camp. We had older, more rundown buildings and much better scenery. There's really not much difference between the events in that movie and my childhood growing up. I went to Bible camp every summer, and we sang songs about being in God's army and laying down our lives for Christ and letting our light shine out to the world and being washed in blood. And we did little song and dance routines to Christian music. My favorite was Satan Bite the Dust. And none of it seemed weird at all to me. It all seemed completely normal. That's not to say that I didn't have my moments of doubt. I think everyone does. I think anyone who denies that they've ever doubted their faith is lying, either to you or to themselves. But when those times came where my faith was shaken, we were taught to turn to God. Faith in my house was an act of will. You prayed to God for the strength to continue on, to keep believing, and eventually that feeling of peaceful acceptance would come back over you. The trick was to never forget that God has a plan, and even though it might be completely lost to us here on earth, once we're dead and in heaven, it will all be clear. I was exposed to the idea of apologetics long before I knew that there was a word for it. Rather than homeschooling us, my parents chose to enroll us in small Christian schools run by our church or occasionally another church in the town we were living in. When I was 8 or 9, I found a book about dinosaur fossils. The dinosaurs had, the book explained, been buried during Noah's flood. Up until that point, I'd known about dinosaurs, but I'd always just assumed that they were fantasy creatures like dragons or unicorns, something that had been invented because they made a good story. This idea that they actually existed in a Christian book in my Christian library was exciting but confusing, because I couldn't understand why they didn't exist anymore. The book explained that the dinosaurs couldn't adapt to the new climate. After the flood, the rains came and never really stopped. And apparently that's what killed them. But that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I mean, there are polar bears that were on the ark, and elephants, and monkeys that live in the jungle, and creatures that live in the swamps, and surely somewhere on the planet would be a climate suitable for dinosaurs, and surely if God could distribute all the animals where they needed to go, he could do that with dinosaurs as well. And so I asked my teacher, and she set me straight. Dinosaurs didn't exist. All the fossils that have been found are either bones of other animals or hoaxes. The book was wrong. I also learned that the Earth had to be younger than 10,000 years old because 10,000 years ago the sun was so large that we would be inside it. And because of this, carbon dating had to be wrong, and there couldn't be any stars further than 10,000 light years away from us. But that was all easily explained away as well. The scientists not serving God were by default serving Satan, and therefore they were open to being tricked by Satan. And they got it wrong. The reason that carbon dating doesn't work is that the decay rate changes. Same with light speed. It's not constant. There's no way of knowing that it's always constant or always has been constant. You don't know. You weren't there at the beginning of the universe. God is omnipotent, and if he wants to change the speed of light so that we have more stars in our sky, he can do it. It's all part of his plan. And for 15 years, I never thought to question.